to even have a chance of being a professional musician. Is that the whiskey?
Mark Graban and Jamie Flinchball are two guys drinking whiskey while chatting about lean ideas, experiences, and news. Let's hope they hold their liquor because they're not holding back on sharing their opinions. It's time for Lean Whiskey, Lean Talk with a fun spirit.
Well, cheers, everybody. Welcome to episode 13 of Lean Whiskey. It's Mark Graban here, and we're joined. It's been a little while. We got Jamie here. How's it going?
I'm doing great. It's good to be back with you here.
So for anyone who hasn't listened to these, it's our podcast co-founder, Jamie Flinchbaugh, and our intent is that it's usually me and Jamie, but we have some guests occasionally.
Yeah, we've had, I guess, 2 guests in a row. So I did my first one with a guest, with Susan Pleasant, and you did a deep dive on healthcare in the last episode with one of your friends from the industry. And so that was a fun one because you guys have done a lot of, especially around the podcast or the blog, a lot of projects together and his contributions to the blog. So that was a fun one to listen to.
Yeah, Canadian perspective, eh?
Yeah, talking about process.
Yeah. And it's funny, my wife and I, it was a fun weekend. On Friday, we went to a Sarah McLachlan concert, and since she's Canadian, I think she said something about, if I remember right, she was talking about writing songs and something about the process, and my wife and I turned to each other like,
Yeah, not many people get to hear that unless you're in our line of work. But I used to work in Canada way back when I was at Chrysler. I lived in Michigan, drove south to get to Canada, Windsor, every single day. So it's become, between that and clients over the years, it doesn't even catch me off guard anymore. It's just part of working with folks from Canada, and who knows who says it right, whether it's them or us. So.
Well, tonight we are sitting here. So Ryan and I drink Canadian whiskey. We are drinking, we'll get into this in a minute, American whiskeys. Tonight is kind of a big American event for a lot of people, a week after the Super Bowl. Tonight is the Academy Awards, the Oscars. We're not watching that.
No, we're not. And I can't remember the last time I did. I have some friends that watch it religiously, but since most of the people that come across the camera or the stage, I don't even know their names. Not a big pop culture guy. Definitely not the thing for me. But I my own American awards, the U.S. women's soccer team, it was just wrapping up winning the CONCACAF region, which is basically the Olympics play-in. So they qualified in the semifinals. They played Canada in the finals, and it was a tight game for a while, but in the end, they had a nice, handy victory to win the CONCACAF championship. So that to me was the only competition that really mattered today.
And it was decided on the field instead of somebody opening up an envelope and hopefully reading the correct winner.
Hopefully reading there was there was just as much suspense perhaps, but now you got to put the ball in the back of the net. So so you're not ending your weekend with the Oscars, but you started your weekend with a concert. What other new fun things did you have going on this weekend?
Well, so my wife and I went to a thing this afternoon, a town near us called Grapevine, Texas, and they actually do grow some grapes. I like Texas whiskey better than I like Texas wine. I'll just leave it at that. But there is a retail establishment that does events on Sunday. So a friend had invited us to go along, and it was a champagne tasting, and get to try small amounts of a couple different champagnes. And the fun thing, though, so drinking champagne was not particularly new, but I got to open a bottle with what they call a saber. Have you ever seen this?
I have seen it, and then I've seen people try to stretch that into other, scraping off the cap with other valuable things. But I don't think I've ever seen it in person, though. I've certainly seen videos.
I've seen it done in person, and I had the opportunity today. And everything comes back to lean, right? Where you think about I didn't have a training within industry style standard work document, but I did have a good instructor, and we're going to talk later about supervision. So I had close supervision, kind of doing some safety checks, and actually I learned if you hold the bottle a certain way, and if the bottle's been prepped, like the wire cage around the cork has to be loosened. And if you hold the bottle in a certain way, so there's a vertical seam, and it really didn't require a lot of effort. We had this kind of maybe foot long, ornate looking sword thing, and it popped right off. I could show you the video of that sometime.
Yeah,
maybe I'll post it in the episode.
I saw the picture, and I actually have a question because I was curious why the cage stays on at all. So I understand loosening it, of course, but why not just remove the cage and then slide off the cork with the safety?
Oh, it's a good question. Afterwards they did give me, and my wife got to open a bottle too. So we each got as a memento kind of the end of the glass with the cork still in it and the cage still kind of loosely around. So maybe they just left it on to give it to us as that memento.
Okay. So it actually does crack the glass.
Oh yeah.
As part of the procedure. Okay.
Yeah. So like I said, even though they did a safety check, this seems like an inherently unsafe thing, but the edge of the glass seems to break pretty cleanly. I guess, you've got to be careful before pouring it that you're not pouring shards of glass.
Sure. Well, it does seem like you would really rather do it with not your best whiskey, because I can't imagine that, or not your best champagne, but I can't imagine that it's the way to avoid spillage is with the saber.
There was a little bit of spillage.
Yeah,
a little bit did, but yeah. So it was a fun thing. So watching soccer is not really, that's not an unusual or a new thing for you. Did you do anything new this weekend?
No, so I watched soccer. I also coached. We had some indoor games earlier today, and Saturday spent a good hour and a half with my tax accountant, going through some changes to my business and doing some planning. And so not exactly a thrilling way to spend a Saturday, a good chunk of a Saturday, but a necessary one. Again, just part of the process. So yeah, my weekend was not filled with things like sabers and concerts.
Well, I bet you learned something though.
I definitely learned some things. I've always been a bit sloppy with those things. I always, just put more energy into I always call it the front of the house, right? What I did with clients than worrying about all the back stuff. I always made sure it was at least buttoned up and conservative, but never really invested a lot of my energy into optimizing it, so to speak. And so, definitely some opportunities there and some lessons. And the guy I work with also likes stories. So he loves, things that people tried to get away with and didn't, and what that informs us about tax law, which, maybe he has a lean accounting or lean tax podcast where he tells stories like we do. But he certainly has a lot of stories of things that he's studied, usually they're pretty easy to study because somebody writes a court case about it, because that's how it comes to light, is somebody stretching the tax law.
I haven't asked my CPA. This seems like this would be a stretch now that we're doing a podcast about whiskey, and this is there are some minor business expenses for the podcast hosting and whatnot. Like, is the whiskey now a business expense?
It's there's whiskey podcasts out there, and I'm not sure if the only reason they do it is so that they can either get free whiskey or get get to write it off as part of their business once they do buy it. I think we probably have to have a much higher percentage of our whiskey drinking on air for it to count. But maybe if we have an episode every other night, then maybe that would qualify as a business expense.
Right. So did your time with Tax Talk and the accountant drive you to drink, or we're just enjoying whiskey because we like it here?
I think we just like it. Actually, no, it's actually more interesting than I would normally expect. So that wasn't too bad. And a long time ago, I think my father taught me this: is never complain about paying taxes, because it means you made money to be able to pay taxes. So
yeah.
You might not like the rate that you pay, but that's about voting. But once it's set, never complain about your taxes, because you just should be thrilled that you made enough money to pay them. So I never spent a whole lot of time fretting or complaining about what goes on there.
Yeah,
a good tax year is usually a high tax year is usually a good year on top of that. So
yeah.
Well, so since we are drinking, and neither one of us, as we don't typically do, waited for us to get to the topic. We're both already a few sips in at least. We'll get to our whiskey selection. Where I do realize that we're going to try to come up with a category each episode. That might get harder and harder. We started talking about this, and we usually start texting or emailing back and forth about ideas. And so I had a few bottles that were nearing the end. So finishing the bottle became the idea. And I guess you didn't have anything close enough to the end.
I did not.
I proposed
empty bottles.
I proposed you still had 2 days to make it a near empty bottle, but that's okay. So I did have something selected, and so we turned it into the new category of the Pacific Northwest. So whiskeys of any variety coming from the Pacific Northwest. So that's our category. So why don't you share what you're drinking from the Pacific Northwest first?
Yeah, so I am drinking. It's from Washington State. And so you know the soccer rivalry better than I do between Portland and Seattle. But this is from Westland Distillery in Seattle. It's the Westland American Single Malt Whiskey. It says here on the bottle, it's non-chill filtered, which a lot of Scotch single malt whiskeys take that approach. There's no coloring added. It says it's 46% alcohol. There's no age statement, so I'm kind of, it's probably a relatively young whiskey. But one thing I know from the research about it is they distill it. They do the whole process end to end. So I think when I bought the bottle, it stood out like, okay, a Washington whiskey, and I would definitely try to buy one from a producer that really does the whole process end to end.
Yeah, I think, if you're going to especially do something in the Pacific Northwest where you do have some interesting agricultural options and of course, some great water supply as well, you don't want something, from Indiana Juice that they just ship over. And it does seem that while the center of the country, everything from Texas to Kentucky is a lot of bourbon as the centerpiece of what it is, or at least corn as the primary grain. Yeah. It certainly seems like the Pacific Northwest is more interested in sort of single malts and as well as with wheat, which makes a certain amount of sense, but certainly seems to have their own little flair in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I mean, and it says here a little bit of research I had done. 90% of the barley that's used in this whiskey is grown in Washington State. So I'd learning about my friends at Garrison Brothers in Texas. They use Texas corn, they use Texas wheat. They had always bought barley from the Pacific Northwest, and until recently they found a Texas source for barley, but I think of the Northwest. I think I've heard of Vermont being a barley growing state. So maybe it's more like Scotland in terms of climate and for the aging and the agriculture aspect.
Well, it is certainly. I mean, the moisture alone fits that bill, and I think that I guess the style of craft is you can find that anywhere, but there certainly does seem to be a connection there between the two. And mine is in a lot of ways very similar, except while your Westland is it's all local ingredients, mine has a lot of imports from Scotland. So I'm drinking.
So tell us about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm drinking McCarthy's Oregon single malt pot distilled whiskey, which I'm putting a lot of the description. You almost don't need tasting notes. They're going to put it right in the title.
And it begs a joke about Oregon. When you say pot still, that has nothing to do with other agricultural products.
No, it does not. At least it doesn't say so in the
on
the barrel,
it
on the bottle. It does not. But yeah, what's interesting about them is they actually use Scottish barley, and they actually import Islay peat. To process that barley. So, one of the peat fields in Scotland are, one of the few things that is hard for anyone to really copy. And McCarthy says, well, we're just going to import the peat from Scotland, which is probably got to be more expensive than importing the barley itself. So they do use Oregon oak. Of course, they use So I think that's neat. They of course use Oregon water, which has its own at least aspects to it. But one of the things I thought really interesting was I always probably say this wrong, but Vidmer Brothers Brewing Company, which does some good wheat beers along with other things.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had them. I can't remember the last time I've had it, but I've had it a few times. And they actually ferment the barley for McCarthy's. So obviously, McCarthy's takes it and, does the mash process and all that, and the distilling process. But the initial barley fermenting is done by Vidmer Brothers Brewing, which I don't know how that translates into the taste, but I just found it an interesting note.
One thing I remember from visiting Scotland, the malting process is something that many distilleries there actually just outsource. So like there's not many distilleries that make their own barrels anymore.
Right.
They buy them from cooperages, and there's some who take pride in saying we make our own barrels. Like, right. Well, that's a vertical integration decision. And there was one that I went to that actually had its own malting floor that they were quite proud of. But so it's interesting to see these choices, make versus buy. It happens.
And I think as long as it's not, open market, they have clear partnerships where they can still control the quality, makes a big difference. Now this is only 3 years old. And while everything about this sort of screams, Scotch whiskey, if you would have showed me a 3-year-old Scotch whiskey, I would probably hesitate to even try it. And so it's interesting that this is only 3 years old, and it doesn't have it. It doesn't taste like an 18-year-old for sure. But for 3 years old, this is really quite good. It's smooth. I think tastes more like Scotch than any other American whiskey I've had. And I drink it neat. Right. If somebody gave me a 3-year-old, Scotch, it's a bit redundant. I doubt I'd drink it neat. I'd probably at least be a mixer, but this is quite good neat. So I do think they're doing something right. and it's kind of disappointed. They do some hand labeling. So this was bottled September 14th, 2015, as part of a batch number. But I'll definitely have to get my hands on some more of this.
Yeah, I haven't tried that one. I've had some other Oregon whiskey. I've got one in the collection here called Westward, which is similar enough to Westland.
Yes.
But I'll have to look for that. But it's interesting that yours is peated, mine is not. And I did find it was hiding in plain sight in my notes, even though it's not on the bottle. Westland says this whiskey is aged, matured a minimum of 36 months. So there could be some whiskey in the bottle older than that. But 3 years is the minimum age of a Scotch that can be released. But American whiskeys, it could be younger because there's not quite, I don't think, the same requirements around.
No, there's, I mean, depending on what you call it, some of the American whiskeys can be 6 months old. Heck, you can release the clear stuff before it's been barrel aged if you choose to, and a few have. But yeah, I think bourbon's 2 years, if I'm not mistaken.
If it's called straight bourbon whiskey.
It's called straight bourbon, right? So yeah, some younger, and they do different, including the churing of the barrels and the first single use of the barrels. They do some other things that allow more flavor to come out of the early years, where a lot of scotches use time as more of an ingredient for the interaction, and of course it doesn't help that their temperature is more moderate.
Yeah.
So it does take longer for the whiskey to interact with barrel in the colder temperatures of Scotland or the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah. So it's inevitable that a couple of lean guys are going to talk about process, right?
Yeah, we haven't shared a single tasting note about other than we like it, but we have covered in detail about how it's made. So.
Yeah. But I mean, the other notes here, talk about how this has been aged partly in new American oak, which Scotch producers would never use. My understanding is that they would never use new oak because it's more expensive. So then this one from Westland is also aged in what they call first fill ex-bourbon barrels. So meaning basically, in bourbon, producers do by law have to use new oak. And so then first fill means basically this is the first time putting something else in the bottle. So that's one element. So Westland is, I think, using a little bit of the Scotch process, but then also kind of putting their own twist on it with some new unused American oak.
Yeah, very interesting. I haven't had the Westland. I'll definitely have to find the opportunity. Now you've been, just since we're on the Pacific Northwest, you've been collecting a list of having a whiskey from each of the 50 states.
Yeah, having meaning I've either I have a bottle or I've had a taste at a bar.
Yeah. So how are you? How many states left?
I believe right now. Well, I think right now it's I've achieved 34, so I have 16 left to go. See, I haven't had that much champagne and whiskey to do the math.
Right. No, not that math. So there's going to probably be some states that are quite difficult.
It is produced in all 50 states, and I've had a whiskey that was blended and aged in the District of Columbia. I don't think anyone is distilling there within DC proper.
Okay. Well, and in worst case, there's a micro still somewhere that might only sell out of their own shop.
Right. Who's legally distilling?
Well, there's legal questions as well.
Selling. But before we get into the deeper lean talk, can I touch on just two other process and terminology points?
Fire away.
Real quick. So, we might have people listening who are indulging us in the whiskey talk, and they might not know all the terminology. But back to Jamie's whiskey, or anything from Scotland generally, or when I was in Ireland, I saw the same style of still. What they call a pot still is a particular shape and process of a still. It's sort of a batch process where you heat a batch of the distiller's beer and it evaporates and condensates. But a pot still is a very traditional style as opposed to what's often used in bourbon production or in Japan and other places. Sometimes what's called a column still, which is more of a continuous process. So as lean guys, you think like, should we cringe at the idea of batch distilling? Because the continuous still, the column still can be run continuously without stopping to clean it out. The remnants from the batch without the change over time. I don't know. Is that a lean?
Yeah, well, there's it all depends on value, right? So,
sure.
I think a lot of the continuous stills are done that way for volume purposes. And certainly you get the process up and running and you just keep feeding the beast and it keeps spitting out stuff at the other end. Whereas with a pot still, you can take a little more care in trimming the heads and the tails and sort of managing the process, because it is a natural process, right? It's not, yes, there's a recipe, but you're dealing with ingredients that don't always act in it's not everything you do. You're not just blending ingredients, right? There's chemical reactions, biological reactions that you aren't in full control of. And so it gives you perhaps more control over the final product, especially with, the heads and the tails and fine tuning it to where you want to be. At least that's what most people that do pot stilling will tell you. Whether it certainly doesn't mean you can't get a good product out of continuous still, but it all comes down to value. What produces what the customer wants, and so the continuous flow of the column still certainly is very different than the batch, and certainly seems more lean. But if it produces an inferior product, then maybe not.
Well, that's why I don't like the word lean as a catch-all adjective. So you could produce, is it better because it's from a pot still? Probably not necessarily so. There's an efficiency, but I think we'd probably agree efficiency is not the end-all, be-all, right?
No, and for most of these, there's large houses that produce a ton, and they almost need continuous process just to keep up with demand. But I'm sure McCarthy's and Westland are not, if they produced at volume each and every day, they couldn't sell it because they're not that big a brand yet. And so it's one of those things where, could they scale the process down to a little tiny column still and size it to their volume? Not sure that really starts to work, but there is the factor that to do a lot of those things at a column still on a 5 days a week or 7 days a week process just doesn't make sense for these smaller places. It's also interesting because I would propose, since they are crafting and they are making more varieties, that it's a lot of them will talk about how they experiment, and they'll even out of their own storefront sell some of their experimental whiskeys. And it's got to be a whole lot easier to experiment with a pot still.
Well, on the small end, and talking about experimentalists, our friend David Meyer, I just pulled up here, he posted the other day on Facebook that his Glens Creek distilling in Kentucky, he's building his 4th pot still, and he builds his own and kind of has control. He's vertically integrated that part of the process. So good for him.
Yeah, and he's finally releasing his Cuervito Vivo, which basically translates to live crow. Since he produces at the Old Crow distillery, he's now making live crow.
And he can't use the name Old Crow because that's owned by Jim Beam.
And still produced, but not to the standards it used to be. It certainly seems so.
But then just the other thing real quick, this is more of a terminology thing, something I learned when I was in Scotland for the first time. So when these whiskeys are labeled single malt, it might be confusing to some listeners. The description of this whiskey says it's comprised of 5 different types of malt. And they might think, well, wait a minute, it says single malt. But single malt, all that means is that it comes from a single distillery, which is a little bit of confusing terminology, but kind of another
that is
choice
important.
They have to make.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of the major brands out of Scotland, especially the ones that became popular in our parents' generation, they bought stuff from a whole bunch of other people and blended them together. Johnny Walker being one of the more famous ones that some like Ko Ila is one of my favorites. They sell to Johnny Walker. That's where I think most of their volume actually goes, but it's not all from that. It should really be called single malter and not single malt.
Single distiller.
But no, it's an interesting description of the Westland. I think I'll have to try that. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, sure thing. So I guess the main reason we're here, more lean talk. We're about halfway through the episode, so we'll focus on lean the rest of the way.
Sounds good. It's always a part of why we're here.
So I found an article. A lot of times we call this segment in the news, but this is not news. This is really more like in the journals. And this is actually an article going back to 2002 from AME Target Magazine. So it's not an academic journal, but it's our friends at the Association for Manufacturing Excellence, or I think they're just AME nowadays. And I forget how I stumbled across this article maybe a month or 6 weeks ago, but the title of the article is Ohno's Method, meaning Taiichi Ohno, of course, from Toyota. Ohno's Method, creating a survival work culture. And the article, when you read articles, people might ask, okay, well, who is it? Who wrote it? One of the authors, Junichiro Nakane, is a professor, at least at the time of the writing, was a professor in Tokyo. It says he knew Taiichi Ohno personally, has studied TPS a long time. Then the other co-author is Robert Hall, or Doc Hall. Jamie, do you know Doc? I see you nodding. I've only met him briefly.
I know Doc pretty well. It's been a while, quite frankly, since I last talked with him. But always studied, his writings, and of course his, he, as I think he does in this article, which we'll get into, tends to study other experts and have his own opinions with equal levels of commitment, and then kind of blends them together. And so, at one moment, he'll be talking about how it really is at a place like Toyota with expertise and conviction, and then he'll seamlessly move into his own original thinking with the same level of conviction. But his, he certainly was. Lots of people have called themselves the godfathers of lean, but he was definitely one of the early pioneers, writing about this in the 80s, and one of the co-founders of AME. And I'd say, I think one of the most servant leader type of these experts that were early pioneers. Very, very humble in the end, very serving of others. Really just wants to help people. Hence the engagement with AME as the opportunity. But a great guy. Really made some great contributions.
Yeah, I mean, he was writing. At least he was one of the first Americans writing books about Toyota, or in like the 1980s. So some of this might have been labeled just in time or Japanese manufacturing, quote unquote, right?
Yep, absolutely. So he was, before lean was a word, and before many of us were studying it actively, he was out there studying, researching, and writing and working with companies. So, like I said, an early pioneer, you get some of his style coming through in this article.
Yeah. And the fact, the article is freely available as a PDF from AME, so we will link to it in the show notes and the blog post for the episode. I mean, it's what, about a 10 page article. I mean, I've read it and I highlighted a lot of it. It's a very dense article. I mean that in a good way. Like, there are a lot of important points in the article. But Jamie, maybe I'll just throw it to you first in terms of, like, one of the things that jumped out to you as something worth talking about.
Yeah, so I mean, it starts off in the title, but it goes throughout talking about culture, and a lot of Taiichi Ohno is given a lot of credit for things like creating real just-in-time pull and doing all these things, and Ohno Circle, but really, what this article really almost starts with is that Toyota's culture, traceable to Ohno, was really what they said was the culture building side of TPS, and is applicable to any kind of business. And I think there was interesting wording, culture building, because I certainly see. First of all, this is an early article. This is not my work on lean equals culture. Predates this article, but back in 2002, not a lot of people really talked about lean as culture. It was still heavy into value stream mapping and tools and practices. But I thought like culture building was an interesting phrasing, because it wasn't about, it wasn't copying culture from Toyota. He really called it culture building. And so I've always believed you can learn from Toyota, you can learn from others, but ultimately, if you're gonna be successful at this, you have to build it yourself. You really have to go through the hard work of building your own culture to make this truly last.
Well, and every organization has a starting point of its own culture, right? So it's not like flipping a light switch and saying, like, oh, we're going to buy a new culture or plug it in like new software. But one thing, going back to the subtitle of the article and the introduction of it, it says, that after the war, World War II, during the formative periods for the Toyota production system, Toyota was fighting to survive. So it says, at its core, it remains a survival culture. And at the end of the article, they're sort of asking, or maybe, they're lamenting or worrying. So, when the money rolls in, a survival mentality fades. And so I think, there's a question around, well, does that culture, is that fading at Toyota, or is it just inevitably evolving because Toyota is pretty flush with cash? But I don't think that means there are any. I mean, I think it's already in different elements around, like, frugality and creativity are probably pretty deeply embedded.
Yeah, I think there's aspects of Toyota's culture that I think we can sort of map to lean. That we can say, oh, those are the aspects of Toyota's culture that are really worth learning from, and there's other aspects that are simply part of their history. And whether they're because they're Japanese or where they grew up in Japanese or the conditions in which they grew up. Now, I do think, so I don't believe, I think this is an interesting question. I don't believe you have to have a survival culture to be a lean culture. That being said, I think you need something to drive you, right? Something to drive you, some pursuit, something that transcends any year's performance. And with Toyota, in a lot of ways, it is survival, but it could be the mission of the company. It could be growth. It could be, as we look at companies like Menlo, joy, creation of joy. It could be lots of different things, but I think you need something to drive you. But I don't think survival has to be there, and has to be that singular element. Yeah. And I'll say this for two reasons. One, as companies I know that have done quite well, that have lots of protections that make survival really a foregone conclusion almost, or it's just not very prevalent. They're not very fragile. It's not very likely. And even if they wanted to create it, it would be a very false premise. So I I get the connection between Toyota's survival culture and their lean culture, but I don't think it has to be the ingredient.
Yeah. Well, I think of, a different, very strong lean culture. My friend Carl Wadenstedt and his company Vibeco in Rhode Island. From my visits there, my understanding, it wasn't a survival need. It was more of a market opportunity. And I think it was, during the Great Recession or whatever we're calling it, 2009 timeframe, they saw an opportunity to build market share by and using lean to improve flow. So instead of batching everything and saying that we could ship any customized product to a customer same day or next day was a competitive advantage that allowed them to grow during the recession. So maybe on some level they feared, like we don't want to let it get to a point where now it's a matter of survival. But I think Carl's motivations were more about growth, which I think is a better, it's a less dysfunctional motivation than an organization that's shrinking and cost cutting.
Yeah, and I do think that the circumstances that you face that helps make that choice may not be in your control, right? I mean, Toyota, out of necessity, had a survival culture, right? Because it was very questionable multiple times whether they could survive. And yeah, they've sustained it most of the time, but it was their circumstances that allowed that to be genuine. There's a lot of companies I've worked with where if you said, "Oh, we need to, be paranoid," like the Intel model or survival culture, it would have been disingenuous and therefore not real. So I think sometimes your circumstances, the opportunity for growth, the pursuit of a societal mission, survival. I think it's what you do with it. I think the circumstances help shape it, but it's what you do with it that counts.
Yeah. Now, there are other really interesting themes in the article. One that jumped out at me, or a couple of them I think are related, is Kaizen, or engaging people in continuous improvement, and problem solving. So, one quote from the article, talked about, making maximum use of everyone's brain power to devise simple, ingenious solutions to problems. And I think that's core TPS. I would hope that, to me, that should be part of a lean culture. But, I think one other thing that jumped out at me along those lines, it says, frontline employees must be more than empowered. They must be enthused. So they must be, so I guess, it kind of leads to the question of, I'm curious your thoughts on this, Jamie. Well, how do you create enthusiasm? Because empowerment without enthusiasm doesn't necessarily lead to action. But, the article talks about creating a critical mass of people who have pride doing Kaizen, leading to that culture. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's, pretty important aspect, because a lot of organizations feel, or a lot of leaders, let's not talk about organizations generically, mm-hmm. A lot of leaders will think, hey, I've given permission to my team or my people 5 levels down, whatever that might be. I've given permission to my team. I've given them training. I've told them they're empowered. Right? Why aren't I getting more? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but sometimes it's just harder to make the changes than to live with the waste. But fundamentally, it's that enthusiasm that I think, what drives people, what should make people thrilled to make an improvement. Sometimes it's the reduction of burden. Sometimes it's just that opportunity to get rid of their own waste. But even as they tried to codify Ohno's method, and I'm not sure how well they really did that. Certainly not in a copyable way. But they also said, derive personal pleasure from accomplishing Kaizen.
Well, that's joy in work, whether that's Rich Sheridan at Menlo or what Dr. Deming would say.
Exactly, and I do think I think that word accomplishment is important, right? So they're not just involved, right? They're accomplishing things, mm-hmm. And when they go home at the end of the day, did they we produced 500 cars today, same as every day, because that's what the standard is. With our quantity control, no. I worked on this quality problem, or I worked on this efficiency gain, or I worked on, you get excited about that opportunity to make a contribution and accomplish something. And I think that's the key driver of that enthusiasm, which, again, going back to culture, this article is really saying that's a big part of what Ohno brought to the table. Is he didn't just empower them, he didn't just train them. I'm sure we'll talk about coaching here in a little bit, but he got them excited about what they were doing. And I think there's a lot to that is often underappreciated in how leaders approach this.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is really more about tapping into people's excitement and innate creativity and pride in work. I mean, this is really powerful in healthcare when you see a really strong culture of continuous improvement. Like, think of my healthcare Kaizen book co-authors health system in Indianapolis, the St. Francis Health System. The enthusiasm about making your work easier, about making the patient experience better, about improving quality and patient safety, the enthusiasm is so noticeable. And that's been, that natural enthusiasm unfortunately gets drummed out of people. I think that fire can be relit through good leadership.
Yeah, and I think, of course, the opportunity, and then, of course, the accomplishment that follows that. And so that's where, it becomes mission driven. What's going to get people excited each and every day? What are they actually trying to solve for? And then the ability to actually make a difference is what's important, because one of the things that kind of keeps people in their jobs, it keeps people stuck in their jobs, is that when it seems harder to go make a change than to live with it, then they just live with it. And so they get stuck as a cog in the machine, and they hate their job every day. So reducing that friction, providing that opportunity for people to make that contribution in a purposeful way is important. But the purpose, I do think, is important. Empowerment isn't, in my definitions, letting people go work on whatever they want. I think there's still guidance and direction. And, Taiichi Ohno set a lot of clarity and guardrails and direction around what he wanted people working on. Mm-hmm. They didn't just go work on whatever they felt like it. But how they solved it, that's where they made their contribution under his tutelage and system.
And part of that tutelage, as the article talks about and they describe as Ohno's method and a leadership approach, is not the leader having all the answers, but it says, it talks here about mentoring and Ohno developing other people by challenging them with provocative questions, stimulating them to improve processes on their own, and then learning to self-manage them. So, I know you had flagged this as something to talk about, Jamie. How's that line up with your experiences or things that you teach, coaching through provocative questions?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that they go on the article to talk about how he coached individuals, but he also coached leaders to then coach other individuals. Mm-hmm. It certainly seems like, and again, we know this if we study all of Taiichi Ohno's writings and stories, etc. I don't spend a lot of time saying we should do something because Taiichi Ohno did it. Mm-hmm. And so I focus more on what the company has in front of them and what the challenge is and how do we overcome it. But certainly, I've said for a long time, coaching is a key element. But usually I'm framing it, quite frankly, as coaching is how you achieve lean. And this would argue that coaching is part of lean, maybe even the central part of lean. Mm-hmm. And so, again, that's just semantics. So I'm not sure it matters much as long as you're doing it and doing it well. But coaching wasn't change management. Coaching was part of his system,
Right.
and part of his methods, and they weren't always pleasant. Plenty of stories about his methods that aren't that pleasant, but fundamentally he did build his system with coaching as one of its elements. And we always say, well, Kanban and things like that are what Taiichi Ohno implemented, but he implemented a culture based on coaching, which is something pretty admirable and I'd say pretty unusual for the decades in which he was doing most of his work.
And when you talk about the coaching, I think this is where even modern day Toyota talks about problem solving or Kaizen is not just about solving the business problem at hand, but first and foremost, developing employees. And I've heard Toyota people say the first priority is developing employees and their skills. The second priority is the actual business results in the short term. So I think some of that ties back to long-term philosophy. But coaching people, not telling them the answer, but helping them understand, which comes back to the stories around the Ohno circle. And I think some of this maybe gets watered down. And the one way this article was really thought-provoking, to me, it comes back to your point, Jamie, about we shouldn't do something just because Ohno said to do it that way, or he did do it that way. There's stories about, Ohno would draw a circle on the ground and he would make someone stand there for the entire shift. Well, this article says at a couple of points, he didn't ask people to literally confine themselves to the circle. And there's other parts in the article, that section where it says he coached, quote unquote, budding TPS leaders, which I don't know if that means younger employees. It says he would draw a chalk circle and have them stand for several hours. But then it also says on the next page that he never did this with executives. It says a popular story is that Ohno made top executives stand in a circle too, but no one remembers an instance when he actually did this. So to me, I think there's the literal history of the Ohno method means you draw a circle and force someone to stand in it. But the article actually, I think, tells a richer story about his approach really being about understanding the current state, whether that means literally standing in a circle or moving around a little bit, go and deeply understand, which is what I hear, more contemporary Toyota people explaining. You've got to grasp the situation. You've got to go to see, that there's more to it than just someone could copy the circle and maybe miss the spirit of all of this.
Yeah, I agree. I think, confining to the circle is really the point. I like the extension of that quote, which was dig through the clutter to see the essential problem. Right. Yeah. And so that's sort of the action. But this goes back to me, the idea of coaching. Right? So in soccer, we have a phrase that the game is the best teacher. The idea is you craft opportunities for someone to self-discover. And a lot of the people I coach sometimes get frustrated because I'm not giving them the answer. And
just tell me the answer, Jamie.
Just tell me the answer. And it's like, no. It's about self-discovery, and that's what makes you a stronger, practitioner, a stronger leader, a stronger coach, whatever, because you discovered it on your own. My job only was to create the opportunity for you to learn that. And I think that's a large part of, the circle. It really, I don't think I've seen any teaching and any writing or research where it says he did that as an actual improvement methodology. It was a coaching methodology. It was getting people to experience it so that they would then value it. I worked with Wada-san, who was one of the few people that went in sort of consulting that didn't work with him, but worked directly for him. A lot of people were sort of second-hand, third-hand associations. Wada-san worked directly for him, and he never drew a circle. But boy, he would certainly make me going back to the quote, dig through the clutter to see the essential problem.
Yeah.
And so the core tenet of that was any mechanism to force that experience.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this article in the next episode and the episode after, and
Probably.
we should have had Japanese whiskey as the theme, perhaps. But I really can't recommend this article enough. I mean, there's a lot in here. There's so many good nuggets. One other thing, maybe I'll throw out for discussion real quick. And again, remembering there was a Japanese co-author of this article. It says here, Japanese ethnicity played a very small part in developing the TPS work culture. Many Japanese managers have no more instinct for it than Western ones, which I think, when we hear people say things like, in the U.S., someone might say, "Oh, well, this would all be easier if we're Japanese." One of the greatest lessons I've taken away from going to Japan, in addition to all of the great things I've seen and the inspiration and the things I've learned, is kind of education around lean or TPS not being the naturally occurring default in every Japanese company. And I think that makes me respect Toyota even more, because they've created this culture out of necessity and leadership and motivations.
Yeah, and I agree entirely. Now, there are some aspects like standardization and an appreciation of efficiency that perhaps are more commonly found in Japanese culture. But if you look at a lot of what Ohno was known for, exposing problems, making problems visible, well, that actually runs counter to most of Japanese culture.
Yes.
And so, exposing problems, the idea of exposing problems rapidly, highly visibly, certainly runs against a large part of that culture. And so I think we can certainly dispel the myth that lean is successful at Toyota because it's Japanese. That being said, just like every company has their own starting point for culture, whether it's survival or growth or mission driven or whatever it might be, you also have differences in country culture that will affect how you approach lean. Whether people are more malleable, more maverick, more open, more conservative, right? Those things will have an impact on at least your change management of how you approach engaging.
Yeah. So maybe we'll move on to the listener question.
Yeah. So I'll first say, before we get into the question, that we really want these questions from folks. So email us. We'll either use your name, or if you say you don't want us to use your name, that's fine too. But I'll say it like this: a lot of you ask us questions, but directly or personally. But the most selfless thing to do is ask them for the podcast so we can share the answer with others. So we really appreciate questions. So actually, I have a question that didn't stem directly from our plea for questions, but from a question that we get through other avenues. And it's really about how do you organize frontline supervision for best results. Obviously that there's a lot of variables there, a lot of different industries. And again, a lot of people tried to copy Toyota in that case. Certainly plays into the article that we just talked about. But again, you have to move from where you are to where you want to be. How you organize that, what makes sense, what do you consider when you do that, makes a big difference in how your teams operate, how they engage, what their culture is. So what are your first thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think my first thought comes back to, from the question, comes back to healthcare, where I spend most of my time these days. And there's a real challenge. The frontline supervisors, whether that's, in some settings, a charge nurse or a nurse manager, or the equivalent in other settings, I mean, they're spread too thin. the number of employees who report to them is much larger than you would see at Toyota in a good lean factory. Or, they're because of staff shortages, they're, instead of jumping in to help occasionally, they're in the work 4 days out of the week. And so then, I think this hampers problem solving. Things just become stagnant. When essentially you don't have, like, from a technical standpoint, you have frontline supervision, but they're not able to do the types of things that were written about in the article that we discussed in terms of problem solving and challenging the status quo. People are just trying to survive.
Yeah, I think healthcare has a particular problem there that there are other industries that it's like legal professions. A lot of startups, especially highly technical startups, have this problem where you're both, senior management and direct labor at the same time. Right? Yeah. So the chief medical officer / cardiologist, how much time, I have a certain amount of administrative tasks to do with my CMO job, but how much can I really spend on culture building and that type of stuff? And this was a problem that we faced when we started the journey at Chrysler some 20 years ago. And we talked a lot. We used a Toyota case study quite frequently. And we would talk about the 5-to-1 ratio between a team leader and a team member. And so everybody's like, oh, well, we need that. We need a different ratio, because our ratio averaged 75-to-1. That was our average ratio at that time. The company was still in, just clawing their way out of bankruptcy or near bankruptcy. Not a lot of money, stripped out. But we also knew that even if we had the money, which we didn't at that time, if we hired a whole bunch of supervisors, we would probably do the wrong things with them. And because we would just do more of what we were currently doing, oversight, administrative tasks, I'll say shoving people out of the way to solve the problem ourselves, all that kind of stuff. Which is why I've said often and for a long, long time, the process should come first, and that should lead any changes you make to the organization. And so, while we might all argue about what a frontline supervisor should do, whether you copy that answer or you come up with your own answer, you got to put your processes in place. Then find out that your ratios are all wrong, and then start to change your organizational structure to fit and serve how you want your processes to work.
Yeah. And, there's no easy answers. This is kind of a broad question, but when you think about layers and span of supervision, even in my last manufacturing company, at one point they had eliminated a layer of frontline team leaders, to use the Toyota language, but it was supervisors. And so then the manager over multiple areas, or what Toyota would call a group leader, basically had 30 to 40 people reporting to them in multiple areas. And so some of these departments were essentially supervision free zones. And, so then that led to a lot of problems, or problems not being solved. And so I think, my understanding is that this had been done in the name of cost cutting and efficiency. And, I'd argue maybe that's a false efficiency, where I can think of one hospital system that had done a similar thing. They had eliminated a layer of management and then learned experientially that, oh, okay, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't the greatest idea. So they put that layer back in, but with very specific standard work, or what some people will call, leader standard work of having a very clear plan for the hypothesis. If we put this layer of management back in and they do these things, we will get these better results. And I think that comes back to the question of organizing that layer of supervision. It's about results. It's not copying what some other organization did.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of organizations would look at what their management is doing and say, well, okay, we don't we don't value most of that, so let's strip it out. Maybe to get to where we really want to be, we have to add it back in, but it's almost easier to strip it out and add it back in than it is to just transform it. You go back to the quotes in the movie Wall Street, where Gordon Gekko's standing up and talking about, this army of VPs who are all just pushing paper back and forth, and if we just stopped that, we'd probably save an awful lot of money, because they were doing the wrong things with those resources. So you have to, again, you have to decide what your process should be before you put those resources into place. We made one organizational change at one company, and we're kind of turning it upside down in a lot of different ways. So you couldn't track from what it was to what it would be. But we actually, quite frankly, lied. We said, we've done a time study on your new job, and the job has been designed so that 40% of your time is spent on continuous improvement. There was no time study. It was just what we wanted it to be. So we just set out the expectation from the start. You're in a whole new job. You're going to have to learn whole new habits. We want those habits formed around 40% of your time with continuous improvement. I don't know if that was the actual number. And you know what? It came, we didn't measure it precisely, but it came pretty much true, because we designed the process, we designed the role, and then we put the resources in place to feed that, rather than put a bunch of resources in place and then hope the right things happen.
Yeah. I guess it's fair to say hope is not a strategy.
Hope is not a strategy, and especially with new resources. Whether you're hiring replacements or adding people, if there's bad habits to be formed, it's an easy opportunity to add them, unless you integrate them in a very purposeful way.
Yeah. Okay, maybe our strategy for bringing the episode to a close includes kind of more of a fun question, kind of close things. So I'll ask the question, you can answer first, Jamie. If you weren't involved in lean or anything operations related, what career might you have pursued?
Yeah, so this is in our fun sort of get to know us category. The things that you would talk about after a couple drinks. If I think about not doing lean, then it all goes into a whole litany of different operational leadership roles that would really not be too far afield of what I'm doing now. So to really stretch, if I go back to other things that I really considered and were on the verge of doing, mathematics was always fascinating to me. It somewhat came naturally. I used to be able to do calculus in my head, which my professor insisted was impossible. And
you got to show your work, Jamie.
Yeah, I got to show your work. I tell my kids now, I got to, teacher said you got to show your work, even though I didn't. But I'm pretty honest with my stories, even if they're not always good examples to follow. But I very seriously considered a PhD in applied mathematics. I don't know what I would have done with it. I just thought, if I'm gonna love math, then I'm gonna go what's the deepest you can go? Well, how about a PhD? So what drove me away from it a bit was actually doing an internship in a research lab with a whole bunch of PhDs. Moved very slowly, and I liked the work. I just didn't like the pace of change. But became very interested in that, and very possibly would have gone down that path.
I'm good with numbers, but what is applied math? I've heard the term, but I don't know what that field is really.
It's really sort of like not math just to serve math theorems, like you would see in, say, the movie Good Will Hunting, but connecting that math to real problems, in how it gets manifested. So you're not just writing, your final work is actually producing something rather than simply ending up in the back of a textbook that 40 people will read, or a journal article. Not that that's bad, just that would be where it'd get applied. And I'd have to say, if I could really pick probably everyone thinks I'd rather be a soccer player, and honestly, I'd probably rather a high-level soccer coach than a soccer player. But honestly, if my talent wasn't a limiting factor, I think one of my biggest regrets is giving up my saxophone playing, and being a jazz saxophonist, playing gigs, and if I had the talent and of course kept it up to do that, that would be a pursuit that I wasn't able to pursue. So the PhD I chose not to pursue. This is one I wasn't able to pursue, but that would have been pretty cool.
So how about I'll answer the question coming from a different direction. So like a lot of kids, I mean, I figured out relatively quickly, even though I played baseball up through my freshman year in high school, it was not in the cards for me to be a professional athlete. Just wasn't going to happen. So then I thought the second best thing, I had a friend of mine in elementary school and middle school, one of my best friends, his dad was what they call a beat writer for the Detroit Tigers. So he got to go.
Very cool.
That was his full-time job. He would go on the road, go to every game. I would be at my friend Scott's house. Sometimes if the Tigers were in town, his dad would be in his home office, and we'd be playing, and we'd hear his mom yell, hey, Vern, Jack Morris is on the phone. And my friend Scott would get to go to spring training every other year. He would alternate with his brother. And so anyway, like to me, that was a dream job because I loved baseball. And like even through high school, I was editor of the school paper. I've always been interested in journalism, and that was sort of an idea that I had. My dad is an electrical engineer, in a loving fatherly way, steered me away from journalism. I don't think he considered what the internet was going to do to journalism. Like it's heartbreaking to me when I see articles about layoffs in journalism that sound like the articles about the decline of manufacturing in some sort.
Right.
So,
right.
So I mean, no great regrets there, because then as I eventually learned, I was able to take writing skill and apply it to things related to lean. So there we go. I can still write. But you mentioned saxophone. I was very serious about drumming and percussion, and like right up until the end of my senior year, I was considering. I went to Northwestern to do my engineering undergrad, but they had a 5-year program that was a dual engineering music program. And one idea I thought I wanted to be like an acoustical engineer and design auditoriums and symphony halls and things like that. And then I learned, like I was taking private lessons from a graduate student toward the end of high school, and I talking to him and realizing like I just didn't have it in me. I love music, I loved playing, but frankly I was getting by well enough on talent, and the idea of being in a practice room alone 8 hours a day and putting in the work to be a professional, to even have a chance of being a professional musician. Is that the whiskey? Being a professional musician. I thought, okay, fine. I'm not going to go that path. Northwestern was expensive enough for 4 years, yet alone 5.
Yes, it was. That's pretty cool. So we either could have started a quartet, and you would have been the percussionist. I would have been the saxophonist. We need a bass player and a trumpet or piano, or you would have written about baseball, and I would have been your statistician. So we could have. We might have ended up with a podcast after all.
We could have gotten in on the baseball analytics movement.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That would have been. That would have been very cool to me, because I love picking apart why a lot of the stats that are used are just the wrong stats. So we could have been on the ground floor of that one. So for sure.
But yeah, no regrets.
Awesome. No regrets. So these are
what could have been
roads not traveled. So now we're here with I guess we never said radio show host, even though we've ended up here with a podcast, or a master distiller either. But I guess that brings us to a close of our first episode in 2020 together.
Yes. And it's good to do that. And it's always fun talking to Jamie, and we talk about sense of purpose. Part of the purpose is we get to chat, and we're glad anybody even cares to listen.
Absolutely. We appreciate everyone that listens. I'm always interested when people bring it up when I travel, whether they ask me a question about whiskey or about lean as a result. But, certainly much rather be doing this than watching the Oscars. No offense to anybody that chose to do that instead.
Right.
But yeah, this was what how we choose to spend some of our time, and we appreciate everyone that spends some of their time with us.
I do appreciate that. And I don't mean to be dismissive of listeners, but I'm thinking like, this episode's running longer than some of our other ones. But if anyone's still with us here at the end, thank you for hanging out with us, whether you're on the plane or in a car or jogging. Thanks for spending time with us. I do
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
We do.
So if this is your first episode and you want to find other episodes, you can find us online a number of ways. You can go to www.leanwhiskey.com. You can spell it the Scotch style, the Canadian style, KEY, or just KY. That forwards to the page on leanblog.org. And then you can also find it through Jamie's website, which is jflinch.com/leanwhiskey. And I would encourage you. You can find us. You can find us wherever maybe you're listening to us through the webpage now. You can find us through the different podcast services: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher. There's probably others that the podcast gets distributed through.
Yep, and we really appreciate it. However you listen to us, rate us, review us, subscribe to us, turn on your notifications. We appreciate you letting us into your life, but share your thoughts so that A, we can get better, and B, others can find us. We really appreciate those ratings, and reviews.
Those rates. That's the whiskey talking.
It could be. It shouldn't have been a long weekend, but.
If someone suggested, that too. We tend to do these on Sunday nights, and our weekends are busy. If someone's suggestion is what the podcast would be better if you didn't have 1.5 whiskeys, well, that may just sit in the suggestion box.
I'm pretty sure it is, and I didn't know. I didn't know we were supposed to stop at 1.5, so I might not be following our standard work at 2.
The standard is still being defined.
That's fair.
It might have been 2. But
either way, it's all good.
Yeah, but this is not the show Drunk History. This is not Drunk Lean. It's Lean Whiskey. So it's lean talk with a fun spirit, as we say. But anyway, let's go ahead. I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Cheers.
Why Mark got 2 glasses? Thanks.